This is Daniel Poppy, host of How to Write Good. Thanks for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media.
Hi, everybody. This is Baxter Colburn from Public House Media. From all of us here at PHM, we'd like to thank you for your support and wish you a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
This is Emily, host of Beauties and Headcanons here on Public House Media. Thanks for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media. Once you're done with this episode, I hope you'll come and check out my show, Beauties and Headcanons, where we talk about nerdy theories, games, TV shows, books, movies, you name it. We're here to talk nerdy to you. A new show comes out every Friday. Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes so you never miss an episode of Beauties and Headcanons. Thanks again for checking out the following broadcast on Public House Media.
Happy Tuesday after Christmas, everybody. It's Fantasy Wizards on Public House Media. Scott Wisniewski, Robert Gardner, hoping you had a great holiday season, hoping you had a great championship week. We know some people play Week 17 championships. We'll try to set you up with some things that might help you with that as well, both today and on Thursday. But first up, what was your holiday?
You know, it was a great holiday. Got to spend some extra time with my son. Got to watch him open all of his presents. Rough fantasy weekend, but a good weekend otherwise.
You know, it's funny you mention that, and I want to lead off by telling everybody that my least favorite player in the NFL is Todd Gurley. And I'm going to tell you a little bit why, and I know you got a story you'd like to share as well. So I played in 7 leagues this year, and 6 of them I made the playoffs. 6 of them I made it to the semifinals. Last week, 2 of my teams lost, and they were directly impacted by Todd Gurley. But 4 teams moved on to the championship. This week, I went 1-3 in those championship games, and the common denominator in all 3 of those losses was, again, Todd Gurley. So essentially, I went 0-5 in the last 2 weeks against Todd Gurley. And in each one of those 5 instances, it was directly the difference between what Todd Gurley scored against my number 1 running back. Okay, so he was the direct impact on my loss. They were all losses of anywhere from 2 to 14 points over the course.
Wow.
The other stat that I find interesting is, including the league I didn't make the playoffs in, Todd Gurley found himself on 6 out of 7 championship teams. So Todd Gurley and his late season explosion was fruitful for owners of Todd Gurley, as I mentioned, in the 7 leagues that I play that aren't free leagues, that are actually big-time leagues. Todd was on 6 out of 7 championship teams. The only exception was the 1 championship I won. I didn't have to play Todd Gurley in the postseason. And I know you had run into the Todd Gurley buzzsaw as well.
Oh, it wasn't just Todd Gurley this weekend. It was the combination of Todd Gurley and Melvin Gordon at running back. Sure. And, I mean, it's hard to overcome when your opponent puts 60 points up just at the running back position. Mm-hmm. And then you get a stinker from Nick Foles. So that was my championship weekend.
I had another guess. One of my losses to Todd Gurley, I actually would have won if Nick Foles had performed even half of what he did the week before, but he didn't, and I lost. So anyway, I have a championship, but boy, it could have been so much more. And while I appreciate that one, I'm going to lament the time. So I feel like next year already, I'm going to have to, just to make sure it never happens to me again, do whatever I can to have to try to draft Todd. By the way, will clearly be a top 2 pick next year. I think no doubt about that.
Oh, absolutely. I think heading into next year's fantasy draft, as I'm mentally preparing for it now, is, you know, your top 3 on the board have to be David Johnson, Le'Veon Bell, Todd Gurley.
Yep.
I mean, no questions asked.
So, and I think, you know, the only reason I say he's a top 2, because some people might wait till 3 to grab Johnson just to see how he's recovered. Yeah, but those 3 are definitely guys you're going to want to own. And yet, because of this bad season Gurley had in 2016, two of the teams I faced along the way in the postseason had both Gurley and Bell on it. I guarantee that doesn't happen next year unless there's some trades that happen that shouldn't happen in your league. I guarantee you Gurley and Bell won't be on the same team next year. So enough about that. We're going to talk about some of the things that went well for players this week and some that didn't. But I want to talk a little about, for those of you who play Week 17 championships, and how the NFL playoff picture may or may not impact you this week. Now, normally, there's some teams that have some things locked up and that are set in stone, and they rest players. There's still going to be a little of that, but the good news for you is the way the NFL has scheduled a lot of the games where the seeding and playoff scenarios are all being played at the same time, you might actually see less resting than you've seen in the past. Now, teams like the Packers are a little bit of an exception. They're likely going to rest Jordy Nelson, Richard Rodgers, everybody who got dinged up in that game over the last couple of weeks, including the game Saturday against the Vikings. However, New England and Pittsburgh are still fighting for seeding. They're likely not going to rest people because they want home field advantage. Okay, you might see some resting in Philadelphia. They're the only team that can't move out of the spot they're in. They're the number one seed in the NFC. That will remain. But the Vikings still have to try to hold on Carolina, so they're still looking for seeding. They want a first-round bye. They're likely to not rest people. Atlanta, Carolina, and New Orleans are still in this hodgepodge of trying to figure out who's going to win that division. They're not going to rest a lot of guys. And Seattle is still fighting for a playoff spot. They're not going to rest anybody. In the AFC, maybe Jacksonville rests. I mentioned that Pittsburgh and New England won't. Baltimore hasn't clinched anything yet. The Chiefs are trying to get a seeding advantage over Jacksonville, so they are likely to not rest anybody. And now that I mentioned that out loud, Jacksonville's likely to not rest anybody except maybe give less carries to Fournette like they did this week. So if you got teams that are in the playoffs, nothing has been solidified. So you are going to be the beneficiary of that. You might not see a lot of players resting, and that might actually help you if you're playing in an archaic Week 17 championship league.
No, absolutely. I think this year, unlike we've seen in years past, there's a lot more teams playing with something on the line down the stretch. So I think that bodes well for Week 17 fantasy players. At the same time, though, this is when the cream really rises to the top in the world of fantasy, because now it's all about specific matchups, just like it was last week in Week 16. But now with the little extra sprinkle you have in there of teams potentially resting players, it makes it that much more challenging, and it makes your waiver wire pickups this week that much more important.
Another guy, I'll jump ahead a little bit, talk about some key pickups, because we talked about Cole, the wide receiver from Jacksonville. I think Wayne Gallman's a guy to look at. But I'll tell you what, another guy who might be one of the top 5 quarterbacks maybe picked next year might be Jimmy Garoppolo, and he might be a guy that can help you this week. This guy's undefeated as a starter. He's made San Francisco look from a doormat to a team that's on the – they've won 4 in a row, for crying out loud. If he's available in any of your leagues, I don't really care what the matchup is. We advise people to not start him because Jacksonville's defense was so good against the pass, and he went off this week.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I was the not only the beneficiary, we'll say, of the Todd Gurley, Melvin Gordon explosion, but Jimmy G ruined my starting defense in the Jaguars this past week. So, as a football fan, I love watching what he's doing, but he ripped my heart out last week as a fantasy owner.
It's Fantasy Wizards on a Tuesday after Christmas. He's Robert Gardner. I'm Scott Wisniewski. Public House Media brings this to you on this great platform. By the way, next week I got an interesting idea for a show I'd like to do next Tuesday, and I'll send out a ballot for you here before the end of this week. I want to go through each position and have you decide who your MVP and biggest disappointment was at quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end. You pick a rookie of the year as well, and then fantasy MVP. And we'll call it our fantasy award show. And maybe we can do that next week, Tuesday, if you're up for it.
Absolutely. I love the idea.
So let's talk about some reasons why you may have won this week. Obviously, Todd Gurley is probably the number one reason why. If you had Todd Gurley, I find it unlikely that you lost this week. But there were some quarterbacks that performed well too. Jared Goff and Blake Bortles, who was quiet for 3 quarters and then got some of those backdoor covers. And you know what? It doesn't matter how they score them; they all count the same, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I tell you what, if you would have told me at the beginning of the season that Blake Bortles was going to win you a fantasy championship, I'd have laughed in your face. But here we are, and there's plenty of people out there that's what happened this year.
Absolutely. By the way, I sat Bortles for Foles in the league where I performed and I lost. Had I started Bortles, I probably would have treated myself to a Bortles jersey because that league is the league I've been playing in for 25 years, so I take that one a little bit more seriously than everyone else. Or if Foles had won me the game, I probably would have searched NFL shop zone and tried to find a Nick Foles jersey. Some running backs that might have helped you this week. Deion Lewis had a big game. And, Mike Gillislee scored as well, and we did say it to everybody that he'll get some increased touches and he'd finally be active with Rex Burkhead being out. But, boy, Deion Lewis looked like a beast. And you know what that means because he's a Bill Belichick player, 5 carries for 12 yards next week.
Oh, absolutely. I gave up trying to get a read on how Bill Belichick's going to use his running backs week to week long ago. I mean, it's hard to put any stock in it. Even when Burkhead was doing good, he was still just a week-to-week option because you just never knew what was going on.
Absolutely. C.J. Anderson, 2 weeks in a row, we weren't sold on him because he had the one good week after several really mediocre weeks, but 2 in a row, let's talk about it. Miracle. I mean, we're not calling it this week Miracle or Mirage, but would you start him next week if you're looking for a running back or at least an RB2 in one of your leagues?
Especially heading into this week with the Kansas City Chiefs matchup. The Chiefs defense has looked a lot better the past couple weeks, but they're still not good against the run. And the way he's been running and the focus that offense has had to put on the running game, I think you roll the dice and you put him in your starting lineup this week.
Larry Fitzgerald may have won you a championship. He's had a couple of quiet weeks down the stretch when Blaine Gabbert was in there, but he got Stanton back, who he's got some familiarity with, scored a touchdown, had some key catches, and may have helped you. And the other one, Stephon Diggs, who was the only touchdown in that game on Saturday night, that snoozer up in Lambeau. Your thoughts on both of these guys going forward? Now, Diggs has a good matchup against the Bears, and Larry Fitzgerald's back to having a quarterback he's comfortable with.
Yeah, I think with Larry Fitzgerald, just what I've seen from him time and time again is regardless of who's playing quarterback, the guy's going to catch 7 to 10 passes for anywhere from 75 to 120 yards. And, he's good for a touchdown probably about 50% of the time. I mean, that's just the feel you get when you look at Larry Fitzgerald and when you just see the numbers he's been able to put up through the course of his career. But really this year, really impressive. And Diggs, don't really like the way Keenum's playing quarterback right now, but Diggs has been phenomenal this year when healthy, and I do like the matchup heading into this weekend.
Interestingly enough, that was the coldest game that Case Keenum had ever played in, and it showed. Now, that's why they wanted to get home field advantage. Now, they can still get a home game, but they're going to want to try to avoid playing in the cold if you're Minnesota. All the more reason why they're not going to rest anybody against Chicago this upcoming week. So we talked about why you likely won. Here's a couple reasons why you probably lost. And I'm going to start out with Devontae Freeman, who in one of the games this week, I had Devontae Freeman. He was outscored by Todd Gurley 32-0. 0 points. So Freeman scored as many points as I did eating turkey watching the game. So that kind of puts that all in perspective.
That's just ugly. I mean, for a team that's battling for a playoff spot in a division championship, you just can't have that. Let alone from a fantasy perspective, just football in general. You can't have that.
That Atlanta defense, and they may still make the playoffs, it's going to be that battle. Very disjointed all year. Julio Jones was very much down with just a few ups. And since we're talking about Freeman, Matt Ryan, another subpar game from a guy who was one of the top 3 or 4 quarterbacks drafted this year in every league I played in. Just another just subpar game. If you counted on him, you probably lost 2 other quarterbacks. Drew Brees, Nick Foles. Nick Foles isn't a superstar. Drew Brees, I've been saying this all year. The arm strength doesn't seem to be there. They've become a run-first team, and he didn't do a whole lot as far as lighting up the scoreboard at the quarterback position.
Yeah, I think this year's been really telling about, Drew Brees. Obviously, age is starting to catch up with him. Like you said, doesn't have the same arm strength. But if you just kind of look at just the change that this team has undergone identity-wise this season, I think we're going to head into next year. If Drew Brees is still playing, you'll have plenty of guys draft him on name value. But, for those of us in the know, we're going to stay away from him.
Absolutely. Nick Foles, I'm not sure what they're going to do with him this upcoming week in week 17 because they don't have anything to play for per se. But I still think there's some value in him getting some reps, especially with the bye coming up after that. Now, there's been an age-old argument, and the Packers fell into this situation when they were 15-1 a few years ago. Do you rest the guys and then give them essentially 2 weeks off and then expect them to be sharp again? Or do you let them play this out, or at least you let them play a half? I don't know what the true answer is going to be with Nick Foles, but he's got a favorable matchup on paper against Dallas. What's your gut feel on how much he plays?
I think with Foles, you have to play him. You have to play him through the course of the game. He needs the snaps. He needs the game reps. He needs to shake off that bad game because he played really well in his first outing, 4 touchdown passes, looked really sharp on a lot of parts of his game. But this past week, nothing was there for him. And we need to get that out of his mouth if the Eagles are going to be successful in the playoffs at all this season.
Case Keenum, another guy, he's got the Bears this week. He's playing at home. Again, rough game. The Packers, had Aaron Rodgers played in that game, Packers actually would have beaten the Vikings, which would have really put the playoff race in a little bit of a turmoil. He didn't. Hundley stunk. Case Keenum wasn't much better. Nice pass to Diggs, but let's go hand in hand because along with that, Adam Thielen didn't do much either, and he's a guy who's been Mr. Consistency. But with Foles not really getting untracked, both of those players likely hurt you if you started them this week.
Yeah, the Keenum performance really hurt Thielen this week. I think we'll see Thielen bounce back next week. I might not expect as big a game from Diggs next week because I think you'll look at that Vikings offense and they'll want to feature Thielen a little more to get him back in the groove heading into the playoffs. So I actually like his matchup this weekend a little more than I like Diggs.
Let's talk about some running backs that hurt, and we'll kind of jump around, and I'll do this in descending order. So Jamal Williams didn't do a whole lot. I was afraid that the Packers would get down and kind of have to give up on the run. He didn't do much. Kenyon Drake was a guy who I thought was going to really have a chance to go off against the Chiefs. Both those guys struggled this week, and if you were starting them as a flex or even RB2, you were let down, unfortunately.
Oh, absolutely. I was – even as a Chiefs fan, I was astonished with how poorly Drake played against that Chiefs run defense. Granted, Bob Sutton had a good scheme in place, but the Miami offensive line was not helping their running back this week. He was getting eaten up in the backfield a lot.
Another running back that, struggled while his counterpart did not was Alvin Kamara, who both games against Atlanta were his 2 worst games of the year. Now, in fairness, the first one he was knocked out with a concussion, but he didn't do a whole lot this week. Another guy who struggled, even though he did score a touchdown, was Leonard Fournette, who just seems to, once he got that injury, he just really hasn't, between that and some off-the-field suspension issues, he just hasn't looked like the same back. I think that injury has been lingering a little longer than they're letting on.
I think that's the case, and I think it's something that if you look back at Leonard Fournette's college career, when he got dinged up in college down at LSU, you saw his production really fall off. He's a guy that is really most effective, like all running backs, when he's 100% healthy. But his body doesn't seem to react to physical adversary as well as other running backs do.
Yeah, that might not bode well if you're looking for a long career in this league, unfortunately. Another guy who was kind of underperformed. I don't want to say it was a disappointment. I mean, he did have some decent yards. It wasn't like he was completely bottled up. But my story as well, how I reached out and grabbed Ezekiel Elliott in 2 leagues, and he just was unable to look like the Ezekiel Elliott that people were accustomed to seeing prior to the suspension.
I think the one thing you want to look at as far as that's concerned is, number one, I don't feel like Dallas was as committed to the run as they should have been heading into that game. I expected a lot more because after that first quarter, they just went away from it, even though it was a relatively close game all afternoon. But the big problem was when Smith went out with the injury again, dinged up. I mean, it just shows you how important that position is in the NFL when it comes to running the ball and throwing the ball.
Absolutely. By the way, Des Bryant looks like I shouldn't say anything can happen. I feel like despite how talented he is and that he may be figuring out a way to play himself out of Dallas at some point or another. Again, just tantrums and drop balls and just unable to get on the same page. Speaking of receivers not on the same page, another guy who scored as many points as I did on Monday while I was relaxing from a weekend's long of travel and too much food was Michael Crabtree.
Oh.
That Oakland game, again, 0 points. It was almost like he wasn't even on the field, even though he was, because I saw his number out there. A disappointment. Again, if you were Monday night, maybe you're down by 5, 6, 8 points. Maybe you're only down by 2, and you're like, I got this in the bag. Crabtree, 2 catches, 20 yards. I get my point. Nothing.
Yeah, I think, if we're going to label disappointments, I think we should just pen the Raiders in to being a part of this discussion a lot, because this whole season has just been a marred mess for them. Carr hasn't looked good. He hasn't taken that step. He looks like he's that back injury earlier in the season has really lingered all year with him. Amari Cooper's got the dropsies, and Crabtree, when he shows up, fantastic, great player. But when he doesn't, you see what happens. Goose egg on the scoreboard for you.
So the Green Bay Packers missed the playoffs. I'm going somewhere with this. This isn't a Packer rant. After making it 8 years in a row. But what people need to understand is what they've done, what New England's been able to do. This sustained success isn't easy. Last year, the Raiders and the Buccaneers were two teams that we were supposed to, they were the teams on the rise, right? They were the teams that this year was going to be their year. Both of them missed the playoffs. Tampa Bay was abysmal. It's not as easy as people think to just be a playoff machine year in and year out. And we saw that with a lot of NFL teams and fantasy players that we were like, this is going to be ready to take the next step. But guess what? The league has film on you. The league stays, they're professionals too. They've got scouting departments too. And Oakland was a key example of a team that really people just expected more out of it. It just never panned out.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, Oakland, like you said, Tampa Bay, the New York Giants.
Yeah. Oh, my gosh. Yeah, they were supposed to win that division, right? Hands down. So you just never know. When you look at the injuries from last week, aside from people who are already hurt like Antonio Brown, and it looks like he may even miss if they didn't get a first-round bye, he would have missed some time there. It's a little bit more serious than people thought. The other big one, DeMarco Murray, I don't know how much you're counting on him if you're playing a Week 17 Super Bowl this coming week, but that injury could be one that lingers